Well, thank you everybody for your invitation to come and speak this morning. Thank you, Peter, for thinking of inviting me, and thank you for making me welcome. And I've been asked to speak about Christian faith and mental health. So the title for this morning is God and Your Mental Health. So that's the direction of travel. If you'd asked me to do a talk like this 10 years ago, I'd have been a little bit stuck, to be perfectly honest. I dare say I could have done something, but the last 10 years has made a huge difference to the way that I understand this and the way that I see it. And there's a simple reason for that. All my life as a Christian pastor, I've been involved in supporting people, many of whom have had a mental health issue, perhaps anxiety or depression, sometimes really scary illnesses like psychosis, where people have really believe that they are somebody other than they really are, or that they're experiencing hallucinations and delusions, quite extreme things sometimes. But I've always felt that I kind of had a handle on what was happening, and I had two friends in particular who were tremendously helpful. I've got a friend who's a Christian psychiatrist in a hospital in Oxford, and another friend who's a local GP, but who's particularly specialises in mental health. And quite often I've been on the phone to those people over the years. But then just slightly less than 10 years ago, our church moved into Bede Tower, the building just near the Mulberry Park in the city centre. And we set up shop in there in 2014. And within 2 weeks, we were what I can only describe as a crisis centre. Because right in the middle of town there, you're right on the border of St Michael's Ward and Hendon Ward, and you're surrounded by people who, it's the highest number of people in Sunderland who live alone, live in that area. We've got a large number of hostels locally, and a women's refuge, and an autism school, and so that area is hugely, anywhere actually in Sunderland is hugely needed, but there were lots of people who just pitched up at Bede Tower and they were looking for help. Maybe so depressed they were feeling suicidal. Maybe experiencing anxiety to such a level that they couldn't leave the house, or other kinds of illnesses. So I took some time early in our time at Bede Tower to understand more about this and to study it and to think about it, not just from the point of view of what's going on medically, but from the point of view of what is going on spiritually and how does the Bible relate to this. So this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to think about the life of King David. And I'm going to start out with two Christian things, Christians and mental health. Number one, if you're a real Christian, you will never suffer from mental health problems. Number two, if you do feel a bit anxious, then all you need to do is pray and it'll go away and you'll feel joyful and happy all the day. I'm getting one or two head shakes, and that's a healthy sign, because those two statements are not true. And to see that they're not true, we're going to look at the life of one of the Bible's heroes. I've picked David. I was tossing up this morning whether to pick Paul, because actually you can tell a similar story with one of the first Christian apostles. But we're going to stick with David. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at how one of the Bible's heroes had a real struggle with his mood, his internal life. We're going to think about how he tackled that, how God helped him in that. And then at the end, we're going to think a bit about how you and I can be a really good support to people who are struggling with their mental health, and a bit about how we can look after ourselves as well. So that's our direction of travel this morning. Now, if you want to read the story of David, I really recommend that you read the story of David. It's very, very entertaining. It's interesting. It's got loads of spiritual lessons. Start reading about 1 Samuel chapter 15, where you meet David as a very young person, and keep on reading until the end of 2 Samuel. And that's basically the story of King David. It's an amazing, amazing story. Israel's second king after Saul, who was a bit of a flop, to be honest. And when you first meet David, he's quite young, actually. He's probably not yet 13. And we meet him because the elders of Israel have asked Saul to admit him to his court for psychological support. And that when Saul begins to develop psychotic symptoms, he gets really, really paranoid and he starts really ranting and raving. David, singing, calms him down. And that's actually a really helpful spiritual lesson, because you'll find when you're anxious, when you're low, spiritual songs, hymns, and music really, really helps you. It's one of those therapeutic things. And you meet that first in the book of 1 Samuel, where David is singing for Saul. But then David becomes very famous by killing Goliath, and later Saul's killed and David becomes the king of Israel. So we're going to look at, the story of David you'll find in 1 and 2 Samuel. But if you want to look at the story of David slightly differently, you can look at the story of David through the songs that he wrote. Now, most of the Psalms we don't have a date for. We don't know when they were written. But there are 13 or 14 Psalms where the bit at the top we don't normally read, which technically we call it the superscript. The superscript tells you when in David's life it was written. So about 14 of them, you can link them to events in David's life. And if you'd like to just read those Psalms and link them to what's going on in David's life, you can do so. And to help you, just on the back, near that tripod, there's a little stack of handouts, just an A4 sheet. And I've listed the Psalms. There's a little Bible reference to 1 and 2 Samuel about what's happening then, and a psalm to read that just enables you to follow the story. And we're going to pick 3 of those Psalms. And the first is probably one of the most famous Psalms that's ever been written. It's Psalm 23. Can you quote it with me? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall lack nothing. He makes me lie in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. Now, Psalm 23 is a song written by somebody in a very, very good place. He's in danger. He talks about the valley of the shadow of death. He's surrounded by enemies. And one of the things you'll learn as you read David's story is that he had a lot of enemies, and some of them were his closest family. He's surrounded by enemies. He's facing death, but I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So here is David in a very, very good place. And he's under threat, but he feels quite calm. He feels very trusting of God, and he's not afraid. He's not afraid. He's leaning on the Lord. And for lots of us, that basically is the normal Christian life. That's where we normally should be. And if you're not like that, then there's something wrong with you. Now, just to tackle that, it's not true, just to tackle that, I'd like us to read another song that David wrote. And that's the one that I read a little bit earlier. This is Psalm number 6. Do you remember it? And, Psalm 6 goes like this. This is verse 1. O Lord, don't rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. Be merciful, for I am faint. My bones are in agony. My soul is in anguish. Who praises you from the grave? I'm worn out from my groaning. I flood my bed with weeping. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. That's written by the same person. It's a psalm of David. Why did David write this psalm? Well, have a look at the superscript, the bit we don't normally read. He wrote it for the director of music in the temple. He says he wants it to be sung with stringed instruments. He tells which tune he wants to be used. We don't know what that tune's like now, but the director of music would have known. He wants to sing this in church on Sunday morning. Now let's just imagine Pete had a burst of inspiration, got his guitar out, wrote a tune, and the opening hymn next Sunday morning is Psalm 6. How would you feel? It's not exactly a rousing first hymn, is it? And not like Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven, or 10,000 Reasons. And here's the second really important thing. The first one, that music can be very therapeutic. Here's the second very important thing. The Bible is incredibly honest about the human condition. And it's good for worship to be as honest as the Bible is about the human condition. And being honest in that kind of way is therapeutic. Now, David didn't have access to a lot of modern psychological therapies that are a great gift from God and very helpful and very useful. So what does he do? He writes a song. He prays, he sings. And that, still today, is an incredibly helpful response to feeling very low or feeling very down. Now, if you go through what David says in Psalm 6 about his experience, it's gone on for ages. How long, O Lord, how long? He keeps thinking about death. Who praises you from the grave? He's bursting into tears. He's not sleeping very well. He's a bit paranoid. Now, he did have enemies, but he's very conscious of them now in a way he's not in Psalm 23. It's really getting him down. Now, I'm not saying that David was ill psychologically. He might have been, but it's too long ago and we don't have enough information to say that. But emotionally, he was very, very low. Now, this is the thing. Mental health isn't just not being ill. It's about being able to cope with those times when we're very sad or very frightened, even though a doctor might not say you're ill. That sometimes we're unwell with an illness, we'll talk about that in a minute. But sometimes we're not unwell, but we're emotionally very low. We've got feelings. And both times we need the support of our family, our friends, our brothers, our sisters, our church. So in some respects, whether somebody's ill isn't a really important issue. The important issue is how we're supporting them, how well we're supporting them, how well we're looking after them. So here's David in Psalm 6, and he's singing with absolute honesty about the way that he feels. Now, there is today significant resistance to the idea that a spirit-filled Christian could feel like this. I could take you to the story of Paul, where Paul says, do you remember those verses in Philippians 4, verse 7? Don't be anxious about anything, but pray, and the peace of God will flood your heart. And that's usually the first thing we go to when we talk about anxiety. So anxiety is unspiritual. Elsewhere in Paul's letters, he talks about anxiety, his anxiety for the churches, his anxiety for his brothers and sisters. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talks about his despair over something that happened in the province of Asia, Roman province of Asia, we call that today Turkey. Something happened, we don't know what it was, he doesn't tell us, but he and his team thought they were going to die and they felt despair. That's not Philippians 4, where Paul was feeling like Psalm 23. Hey, everything's fine. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul's in an entirely different place and the fear really hits him. And one of the reasons I think Paul wrote 2 Corinthians was to get the Corinthian church back on track, but it was also to get himself back on track. And it's in 2 Corinthians that Paul says, when I am weak, then I am strong. And sometimes those psychological weaknesses, and this is the third big thing, sometimes the psychological weaknesses put us in a frame of mind where we have to lean on God so hard that we're more fruitful spiritually than we are when we're full of confidence and full of needs. So David in Psalm 6, he's just kind of reflecting the experience of godly people down through the centuries, not just in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well, like Paul. And in the modern world, one of my favourite writers on this issue is the old-time Baptist preacher, a guy called Charles Haddon Spurgeon, who wrote a 3-volume commentary about the book of Psalms. It's called The Treasury of David. It's one of my prized possessions. Now, if you read what Spurgeon writes about Psalm 6, you're reading the writing of a man who knew exactly how David felt, because Spurgeon had a long-term experience of depressive illness. He really was ill. And an event when he was young, he was in his early 20s, when the place they were meeting, there was a bit of a stampede, and I think 6 people were killed trying to get out. And after that incident, Spurgeon's wife, in her diary, wrote that it only had to be something small to send Spurgeon into a downward spiral emotionally, full of fear, full of anxiety. At this distance, 150 years later, it looks like PTSD. But you can't diagnose at this distance, but it looks like that. And Spurgeon, when he's writing about Psalm 6, and if Psalm 6 isn't gloomy enough for you, have a look at Psalm 88 this afternoon. That's a bit deeper. But Spurgeon, writing about Psalm 6 and Psalm 88, says this, and I think this is a very precious way to express it. He says, "My friend, the problem is in the imagination, but it is not imaginary. It is very real." That's a very powerful thing to say. So saints, serious Christians, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament and in the modern world, are people who encounter this, and it's part of the normal Christian life. And, well, let's look at the 3rd Psalm, because this is very encouraging. And the 3rd Psalm that we're going to look at is the 3rd Psalm, Psalm number 3. And this is a psalm, one of my psalms with a date on it, because it says at the top, a psalm of David when he fled his son Absalom. I'll tell you the story just to fill in. David has been king for many years, and he's been successful politically. Israel is at almost at the height of its power. It would become more powerful under Solomon, but it's doing pretty well. And David has a large family. Now, David's a brilliant leader. He's a brilliant military leader. He's a brilliant king. But he struggled as a father. And he was very poor at keeping sometimes really unruly kids in check. And when I mean unruly, I don't mean graffiti, I mean murder and rape, okay? The story's pretty grim. And in the end, a man called Absalom, who's a son of David, is determined to get David off the throne. Absalom's sister was raped by another one of David's children. David did nothing. So Absalom was really good looking, and he was very good at getting alongside people and said, you know, if I had some power, I'd do something about that, but don't know that David would. He's a classic populist politician. And eventually, he raises an army. He marches on Jerusalem. David does an amazing thing. Rather than lock Jerusalem up and have Absalom siege the city and everybody starves, David leaves. He takes the fight away from the city where a lot of people are going to suffer if he stays there. And he's in the wilderness. He's sleeping rough. He doesn't know where he's going to be sleeping the following night. And this is what he writes. "O Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him." That's quite difficult, isn't it? Living in a culture where everybody says, well, God isn't there. He's not going to rescue you. Psychologically, that's quite hard. But you are a shield around me, O Lord. You bestow glory on me and lift up my head. To the Lord I cry aloud, and he answers me from his holy hill. Now this is great, this two-verse couplet. Verse 5, I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear the tens of thousands drawn up against me on every side. Arise, O Lord, deliver me, O Lord my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw, break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people. So if you're a Christian dentist, your job is to keep the teeth of the wicked in really good shape so that God can eventually break them. But it's that verse 5 and 6 that I love. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. As a pastor, one of the questions I ask more often than anything else is, how are you sleeping? The answer to that question tells you an awful lot. Because very often, when we're anxious or depressed, sleep is the first thing that goes. We may be anxious about something that's happening to us or our family. Sleep is the first thing that goes. We might be anxious about nothing at all, and we just feel it's silly, and I don't know why I'm worried, but I'm worried. And sleep is one of the first things that goes. Here's David. He's been booted out of his capital city. He doesn't know what's going to happen next. But he trusts God. And he sleeps like a baby. And I think that's very powerful. How do you get there? How do you get to that point in your life? I think you get to that point in your life by accepting that there are ups and downs. There are going to be seasons when you trust God and feel Psalm 23. There are going to be seasons when you don't and you feel like Psalm 6. But here's the big thing. As you get older and you practice trusting God, you find that your trust in God works better and better. In other words, faith isn't a switch. You throw the switch and bing, the lights come on. Faith is a muscle. And as you use the muscle, it grows. It gets stronger. Its endurance improves. And if you keep on using that muscle, it gets to the point where you really do find that as you trust God, you feel less afraid. And you sleep better. And that comes with experience, it comes with age, it comes with going through difficult times. And you say, well, why does God let this happen to me? For that reason. Because you can't exercise the muscle unless you put some stress on it. And the stress is good because it makes me grow. So when Paul is facing that hassle in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he says, why did God let this happen? God let this happen so that we could learn to trust him more. So when I'm facing anxiety, when I'm facing a depressive period in my life, whether I'm ill or not, this is an opportunity to grow in my ability to lean hard on the God who loves me and who can save me. And that's a really, really important lesson. The other thing that Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 is, it's through our struggling like this that we learned how God comforts, and we can pass on that comfort to other people who experience the same things. In other words, these struggles enable us to learn to trust God better, but they also enable us to empathize with others who are struggling in the same way. So when you face anxiety, when you face depression, things people can't see. If it was a broken leg, you could say, look, my leg's broken, there's a plaster cast. Oh yeah, we understand. But quite often when you say, I'm a bit depressed, people then sort of go into flim-flam mode. Oh, don't be silly. Oh, it'll get better tomorrow. Here's a Bible verse that'll cheer you up. Quite often people do unhelpful things because they can't see what's going on. When I've suffered like this, I don't do that because I know what it feels like. And I can empathize. So when we face these challenges as Christians, God is teaching us to trust him better. When we face these challenges as Christians, God is giving us a superpower, the ability to empathise. And you might remember, if you know the book of Hebrews, those of you who know your Bibles really well, one of the reasons Jesus suffered was so that he could empathise with us. When you talk to Jesus about this, he knows exactly how you feel, because there are times he felt the same. And that's immensely precious when you're talking with him about what's going on in your life. So, last little bit of this. How do we support? How can we help people who are going through these kinds of things and who might just say to us, hey, look, I'm feeling really anxious, so I'm feeling really low at the moment. They may be ill. They might not be ill. But at any point when our mood is low or when our fear is high, we need support from outside. So I'm just going to give you 4 things. And here's the first. Believe that person. Believe that person. Some people do use mental health as an excuse. Most people don't. Believe them. Take them seriously. Or, can I say this? Believe yourself. If you're facing these kinds of challenges and you keep brushing them out and say, I can't possibly be like that, I'm a Christian. Well, David was like that. And Paul was like that. So what makes you the exception? For goodness sake, just acknowledge it. Believe yourself. That's the first thing. Believe that person. Here's the second thing. Listen to them without judging them. And that's quite hard for Christians, because Christians find judging so much fun. We love it. Just listen. Let that person talk. Do you remember the first time we meet Jesus in the Gospels? It's in Luke chapter 2. The first time you meet the Son of God in the Gospels, what's he doing? He's listening and asking questions. That's what made him so good later on. He's listening, he's asking questions. And that's a terrific model for you and me. Listen, let that person talk. Don't interrogate, but just ask the occasional question. And let that person talk again. We may want to say, don't be silly. We may want to say, that's not really happening. Hold back on that. Just let that person talk. Good questions to ask. How are you sleeping? How are your relationships going? Can I just ask, can you help me to understand why you're feeling like that? What's behind that? Just let that person talk. Ask the odd question that will open up that person to help them talk a bit more. Quite often, 9 times out of 10, people will find that conversation so helpful that they'll feel better immediately. And here's the third thing. Just ask, can I pray with you about that? And pray with them about that. And bring those things to God. Help them to bring those things to God. And pray for them. Ask God to come and ease the anxiety, lift the mood, lift the depressive feelings. And here's the fourth thing, and this is really important. Follow through. So you have a chat with somebody, they've opened up to you, and you go your separate ways. Why not send them a text the following day and say, how are you doing today? How's things? Or a phone call. Listening to someone is really helpful, but just following up is incredibly helpful for so many people. Don't just have one conversation and drop them, but follow people through and listen. So, I'm almost finished, but just one last thing. We've talked about how people can be emotionally low, but not be ill, and that's true. All of us have got feelings, and we might not necessarily be ill, but some of us might be ill with an illness we call anxiety, or an illness we call depression, or something else. how do you tell? How do you tell when someone might be unwell? And the great answer is, you'd be relieved to know this, you don't. Because that's a medical decision. It's not a decision for me. But some things in our friend might give us some clues that might lead us to say, do you know, I think you ought to have this conversation with a doctor. Why not go and see your GP? And there are 4 clues. And the first one's time. How long has this lasted? So for a depressive illness, a doctor would look for feelings of very low mood lasting for longer than 2 weeks. And there'd be other symptoms as well. For an anxiety type of illness, a doctor would look at maybe 6 months. Feeling like that more often than not for 6 months. If people have been feeling these feelings for a long time, that might be an indication that they're not well, they need some treatment. Here's the second thing, severity. Are those feelings just difficult, or are they overwhelming? And they really, really do dominate my horizon. If the feelings are overwhelming, feelings of fear, feelings of being very, very sad, very, very low, if they're overwhelming, that might be a good moment to say, hey, look, why don't you go see your GP? The third thing is disruption. How much is this disrupting that person's life? So if you're a bit anxious a lot from time to time, and it comes and goes, that's one thing. But if you're so anxious you can't go to the shops in case you have a panic attack or you make a fool of yourself, that's your fear, then that might be indicative that you could do with a bit of therapeutic help. And it might be an illness rather than just your mood, your feelings. And the last thing is control. Can that person manage those feelings, or do they find that those feelings are managing them? Most people are anxious, often for good reasons, like I'm going for an exam and I'm waiting for the exam and I'm going to go in that room and I'm going to be asked loads of questions and I'm terrified. Yeah, but you're there. You're in control. But for some people, the fear is so great that they don't turn up. The fear is so great that their behaviour changes. They can't control it. And at that point, it might be really, really helpful to see a doctor and to talk about all those things. So, there's David, and there's a little bit of a peek into the life of the Apostle Paul, and I could rabbit on for the rest of the day, to be honest, about ways in which mental health plays a part in the lives of people that we regard as heroes. And do you know why they were heroes? Because they faced those problems and yet still had a tremendous impact for God. And I really believe this, that the real heroes in the church are not those who never feel afraid and who never feel low. They're those who feel those things and still serve and still bless others and are still great to have around, even though they've experienced spiritual ups and downs like some of our heroes from a long time ago. Let's just pause there and let's pray before we sing a hymn, which is actually taken from Paul's Psalm 23 moment in the book of Philippians. But let's just bring this to God in prayer. Father, if this congregation is anything like mine, there'll be a number of us who have experienced these challenges and sometimes have felt overwhelmed by them. And Father, I pray that you might minister to our hearts. We learn to trust you. We don't suddenly switch on trust. We learn to lean on you. Help us to learn to lean on you harder. And help us to experience the peace of God that comes through the work of the Holy Spirit and the support of our friends. Father, there are many of us who've never experienced this to a great degree. Give us empathy. Help us to learn to listen without judgment. Help us to be people who are, as Jesus was, really sympathetic. And I pray for the church. I pray that you'll help this fellowship to support its wounded, and also in reaching out to the folks round about to support them too. Help them to do it skillfully, wisely, biblically, and in the power of the Holy Spirit. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.